After taking a bit of a break from the Iron Bottom Sound surveys, we return to that this weekend, specifically to one of the more interesting, if smaller, discoveries. Much has been made, especially in recent years, about American cruisers losing their bows. This was a common enough thing, though hardly unique to cruisers. Destroyers could have it happen as well, and it equally wasn't unique to American ships, though they often survive the damage, so it's become mimetic as a result. The Battleship New Jersey channel went into this, and I'll link that in the description. But I'd like to add that relatively thin bows break from damage isn't necessarily a compromise or a design flaw. HMS Jervis and Javelin lost their bows. The latter lost her stern as well. And then there's USS Ernst G. Small, which lost her bow to a combination of mine and storm damage. However, those bows once lost are rarely seen again. They sink away into the darkness, far too small for any dedicated survey, and often in locations where other surveys won't go in looking for larger wrecks. That didn't end up being the case with USS New Orleans. While by no means a priority target, her bow was located as Nautilus scanned the general seafloor off Guadalcanal. They were scanning the entire area in the hunt for targets and happened upon the bow, or what's left of it anyway. There's not much, as you could expect. While the front third or so of New Orleans was blown off, that explosion wrecked much of the bow, though there was enough left to identify conclusively what they had located. American cruiser bows are, of course, rather distinctive. For today's video, we'll be looking at that bow, but also the similarly detached bow of USS Astoria. As a sister ship, it makes for a good comparison, even if Astoria's bow did land in a rather more interesting position. As a note, however, this video will be on the shorter end. There's less to talk about, and I chose that deliberately since I've been fighting off something for over a week. That detour aside, let's briefly touch on how the bow ended up in this position in the first place, before we move to the wreck on the bottom. This came at the Battle of Tassafaronga, known best for the sheer carnage done by Japanese torpedoes on November 30th, 1942, rivaled only by similar damage dealt at Columbangara later in the war. As for Tassafaronga, this saw Northampton sunk outright. Pensacola was heavily damaged as well, though she remained afloat. Minneapolis and New Orleans, for their parts, both took torpedoes to the bow. Minneapolis had her bow bent downward, but still attached to the ship. New Orleans suffered worse. Her bow was blown clean off. The torpedo struck by the number 1 turret and detonated the forward magazines. This wrecked the entire bow just ahead of the number 2 turret. 150 feet, 46 meters of the ship in all. The bow initially hung on before being pulled free as the cruiser continued on. This caused damage along the port side as it swung about, from holes punched in the side to damaging one of the props. The damage seen here is terrible to look at, all the more so when you know that everyone in the second turret was lost as well. 183 men in all between the 2 forward turrets and other crew stationed in the bow. Despite this severe damage, however, New Orleans managed to stay afloat. She would limp into Tulagi, where coconut logs were used to patch the damage. New Orleans would sail stern first to Australia, where a temporary bow could be put in place, and then return home in mid-1943 for a new bow entirely, at which point she served out the rest of the war with that new bow. The original bow, meanwhile, was lost on the bottom. It wasn't found in Ballard's 1990 survey, nor was it found when Octopus stopped by in 2015 or Petrel in late 2018 and early 2019. As I said, it was a fairly small target and definitely not a priority. That Nautilus found it in July 2025 is down entirely to their methodical approach, sonar scanning the bottom to find any targets of interest instead of focusing on the big points of interest. This allowed them to find the bow and spend several hours examining it. What they found is about as bad as you'd expect. A twisted mess of steel on one end with a mostly recognizable tip, all of it covered in marine growth due to being at the relatively shallow depth of 675 meters, or 2,214 feet. What they didn't find, on the other hand, was the number one turret. So exactly what happened to that remains a bit of a mystery. As for the bow, we'll start here, at the break itself, which already has some interesting details to note, namely how bent and twisted the steel is. On other broken bows, like Furutaka here, it's a cleaner break. Astoria's bow is also fairly clean by comparison. New Orleans, meanwhile, is bent and buckled. This neatly demonstrates how the bow was twisted off when it broke. That twisting motion would have bent the metal pretty badly at the point where it broke. Warship-grade steel is tough, but even it has its limits. And the further up you go, you just see more of that twisted metal, both above the seabed and buried into it here. It makes identifying anything on the broken part difficult at best, though we do have an interesting look here, where the plates are pulling apart from each other. As things continue along, though, more typical damage starts to become apparent. Damage quite similar to that of Astoria, where the deck broke apart, leaving a gaping hole in the top of the bow. We have a pretty close comparison here. Not exact, but you can certainly see the similarity. Though on Astoria, more of the bow is still visible, due largely to how it landed on top of the cruiser's stern, which has left more exposed, compared to New Orleans, where a good portion of the bow is buried in the soft bottom. There's still some details, of course, such as the anchor, but a good bit is lost forever. Although, that said, the front of the bow is clearly recognizable. From above here, where we can see a good bit of the deck equipment. Equipment we can see better in a couple other pictures as well, with some anchor chain falling down to boot. Moving on, we have where the tip of the bow comes into frame. Another example where there's a good comparison shot on Astoria here, though unfortunately a bit of a dark one. This look from the Octopus survey is a better comparison. As for New Orleans, much of the bow's details are obscured by the mud, even where they aren't directly buried due to decades of silt falling on the bow, closer to a century than away from it at this point. Nonetheless, we still have the tip and various trash, but even on much deeper wrecks, that's an issue. Despite this, the overall form remains visible, especially at the bottom of the bow, where much less is buried outright. I'm not actually surprised this is in better overall shape. Further towards the tip, there was less damage. Much of that was concentrated back towards the initial torpedo hit and later the twisting motion. Though, since there's not much to touch on here, let's shift back a tick to the anchor. This is another feature common to American cruiser bows. We saw it in the octopus surveys of Astoria and Vincennes, as well as the petrel survey of Indianapolis. All three of these showed the anchor in more detail because they had much less marine life to contend with. On New Orleans, the anchor is pretty much completely covered. Even when you move in closer, it's very difficult to make out any sort of fine detail. Not from the side, here and here, or from the front, here. Some of the writing is still faintly legible, enough that the Nautilus team was able to outline it in their video, which is, of course, linked in the description, specifically the upside-down Navy yard. Unfortunately, the rest is too hard to make out, though you can faintly see what looks like an O and an L beneath it. Either way, let's move back towards the break, where there are a couple details not directly related to the break to look at. First, this hole here. Exactly what this came from isn't clear. It's definitely at least somewhat from rusting looking at the raggedy edge, but what caused the initial hole isn't quite as apparent. Possibly shrapnel, though I couldn't say for sure. The same applies to another pair of holes further up. These also seem to at least partially be rusted out. But equally, it's not quite clear what created them in the first place. As a side note, in this general area, Nautilus picked out what they believe to be a faint 3. I can't quite see it myself, though I'll admit to being bad at finding details like that. Regardless, once we move beyond those mystery holes, we come to the top of the break. I'll round things off here, where we have by far the worst damage. Especially here, where the bow has split open, and apart for that matter. There's not enough in the way of identifying features to guess why it split here. Maybe more damage from the torpedo, or the secondary explosion, or from the twisting motion as it tore free. Either way, it's left a massive gash from the deck almost to the keel, exposing a lot of the internals, though most of those seem to be flat out missing. Especially here, where we just have an open void. It's not pretty, even if it is somewhat expected. It's also something we don't really have a good comparison to on an American cruiser wreck. Furutaka's bow comes close, but it's not identical either. Slightly further back, we have this bit here, where the metal seems almost folded over, creating an interesting shift in the rusting pattern here, though anything below the break isn't really recognizable. No more than this bit of collapsed deck here. There's scattered debris behind it, and ahead of it, a hole in the deck itself, with that hole being where the video comes to an end. It's a clear tear where the deck plating was broken apart, exposing some of the inner workings of the cruiser's bow as it fell away. Notably, what seems to be a motor of some description here. That's fallen down a little and would likely have fallen out if more of the deck had fallen away. There's also a cluster of wiring behind it. But that brings us to the end of the video. As I like to do with these Nautilus coverage videos, I'll wrap up here. A view of the ROV shining lights down on the wreck, illuminating something lost for over 80 years. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.